Well, thank you very much indeed for the kind, if somewhat ambiguous introduction. I'm trying to take on quite a lot this afternoon, so you'll excuse me if I go at a bit of a gallop. To start off with, I want to explain to you why I'm here. I'm here because I've been called to account. I've been called to account, apparently, over something that I said at a CNTA workshop last November. And it involved two words, a very short word and a rather longer word. The first word was cite, S-I-T-E. The second was expunge. I'll try and explain why those two words belonged in the same, more or less the same sentence. Will come out of my what I'm going to try and say to you in the next 20 minutes. I'm going to start, as a lot of people do, with history, relatively recent history, 1978, when the mining company CRA was prospecting for mostly oil, but other things as well, in the Fitzroy River Valley in Western Australia, just to the west of Fitzroy Crossing. And the local community of the station called Nukunba were upset and disturbed about this happening and sought advice from the Aboriginal Legal Service of Western Australia, who advised them that, as far as they could see, the only way whereby they could oppose this exploration work on their land was through the Mining Warden's Court in Broome. They then proceeded and invited me to undertake a piece of fieldwork on the station, working with the traditional owners, in order to document their relationships to land. I undertook to do this, and I was working in the field for a couple of weeks. It wasn't a long survey, but I covered a lot of ground, as you can imagine. And I produced a report. This is not the report, this is a piece of my field notes, but it's significant because I think it's page 28 of my field notes at the time, written on foolscap paper. You can Google that, those of you here who don't know what foolscap is, but it did exist and it was very popular at the time. This is a piece of a page of my field note, which was relevant because it had to do with a particular area that I was looking at, what I called a site complex, called Umbambur, where the gazetted place name was P Hill. I wrote a report based on this and other information, which was filed in the Magistrates' Court, in the Mining Warden's Court, which is before a magistrate, and I was called to be an expert witness, along with the traditional owners, some of whom also gave evidence. And eventually, perhaps as everybody had predicted, the case was mostly dismissed with very little concession on the part. It was my first experience as an expert witness, and following up from something that was that Laura Lee said this morning, it hasn't got any easier since that time. I'm not going to talk about any more about that, except to point out that when I started researching this paper, I actually pulled out this report. I still believe it, and I have a copy of it that was written. What I discovered was that I had written something which quite surprised me. And I've taken the liberty of reproducing it here. And I'll just read it to you. In this, I was talking about the inadequacy of the word, this word that we're looking at today, site, S-I-T-E. In this sense, the term Aboriginal site as a defined location is redundant. Aboriginal thought admits that some places are more important than others, but cannot easily accommodate the notion that one place is a site and another is not. The whole landscape was believed to be the result, to a greater or lesser extent, of the activities of the dreaming ancestors, and was accordingly all imbued with spirituality. The sequel to that action in the Mining Warden's Court followed a couple of years, a year, just over a year later, with what has become known and is embedded in the literature as the Nukumba dispute. And for those of you here not familiar with the Nukumba dispute, there was a book written by Hawke and Gallagher in 1989, which is probably the best way of looking at that. But there was also a thesis by Bernard Moiseau, and also a book by Eric Kolig. This is a very important and a watershed, in a way, to the ways in which the interface between Indigenous cultural knowledge and property and the legal system, or the system of dominating Western thought, were to attempt to try and come to terms with each other in an uncompromising and unsatisfactory way. The dispute centred around this place here, which is shown on the right-hand side, Umbambur, or P Hill, and the drill site, which is what it looks like relatively recently, which is now just a boggy area, is in the forefront. So you can see perhaps the most significant thing is that this was not actually going to be a drill site on P Hill, on Umbambur itself, but it's approximately 3 kilometres away. The story of the Nukumba dispute and the dispute and the opposition, the protests and the arrests which followed is another story altogether. It's a long story, but it ended up with the drilling going ahead with massive bad publicity both to the then court government of ultra right-wing persuasion, in my view, and a lot of damage to the mining company. This was Amax Petroleum. The drilling went ahead. This is what's there now, a little memorial as such. It tells you the date and the fact that the depth was, I think, just over 3,000 metres. The fact was the well was dry. Looking at the site of Umbambur and the drill site from the satellite through Google Earth, you can see the location of the river, which is a significant factor in the ethnography of this whole area. The drill site, which I've marked there, and P Hill. The fundamental argument which was being put by people like, particularly by the then Premier Sir Charles Court, was that this was where they wanted to drill was not a site. It was not a site. Now, the Court also had a few things to say about it, them not being genuine Aboriginal sites, that they were sites that were really the product of white fellows, white advisors and their ingenuity, and that genuine Aboriginal sites would always be protected. So, looking at this map, I ask you to say to yourself, if you saw that, would you think that where the drill was a site on the information that I've provided? Field note, detailed ethnography about the hill itself. But this is 3 kilometres away. Surely it's not a site. I mean, the site is P Hill. Now, of course, there's a lot more to it than that, as this map here, which is actually taken from the Hawke and Gallagher book, although I apparently originated it, although I don't seem to have that anymore. That's a reconstruction. But you can see those are lines which I drew during this field, just after the fieldwork, from my field notes, showing where the great mythological beings of the Dreamtime had moved across the landscape in multiple directions and in multiple manifestations. And in fact, the drill site is right, if you look at it carefully, because P Hill is marked there, I think you can probably see it there. The drill site is at approximately the transect of the Nangala snake and Unyumbu and the two snakes, which is a major myth line, and created the form of the Fitzroy River. So there was a lot more to this. But the point that I'm trying to make about this is that the word site had become very important. And just by footnoting, if you like, that was what I was saying last November when I said, I think this is what I said, that the word site should be expunged from the English language, at least in the language which we use. Now that's what I'm talking about this afternoon. I'm bringing out to you the idea that maybe this idea of site is something we need to think much more carefully about, because it's a disarmingly simple little word, isn't it? Four letters, easily said, and it has come to have a meaning, which I'll look at in more detail in a moment, as to the complexity of what is now tied up with the idea of a site. And in my view, my submission this afternoon to you is that most of these are negative. And therefore, I say with some conviction that I think I was right in saying it is a word we either do not use or use with great care. All right. In thinking about this paper, what I did was to think to myself, well, how have anthropologists, you know, I'm a native title anthropologist. I'm an anthropologist. I belong to a discipline of anthropology. This seems to be a word which has been used by other anthropologists. So I went through and read quite a few things to see where site turned up. Now, I don't have time this afternoon to go, this would be another paper altogether, to give you chapter and verse on all of these. This is just, I'm not expecting you to be able to read this. Don't strain your eyes, because what I'll do is just summarise what I discovered, and it is very much a summary. Early ethnographers tended not to use the word site at all. It is not a word which has been used in in early ethnography. Some of them use the term spot, you know, S-P-O-T, meaning like a place, but mostly it wasn't a thing. It hadn't become institutionalised as it did later on. Other writers who came a little bit later, but with one exception, which was Spencer and Gillen, didn't use the word site, but they did talk about quite a lot about the importance of place. But when they were writing and describing the importance of place, they did so in a very broad context. The context of social relationships, ritual relationships, the relationships to country, particularly through totemistic beliefs. And if you like, the place, the site, was somewhat incidental to that account. It wasn't incidental that it wasn't important, but it was contextualised. That's the word I've used, contexture, as the title of this paper, which relates to the complex woven fabric which underlies some thing or idea. There was one exception, and there certainly was a rise in the development of the use of the word site. And that was probably Ronald and Catherine Berndt. If you look at the World of the First Australians 1964 edition, which is the only edition, those who are aficionados of the Berndt work, it is the only version of that book which has a decent index. I counted over 56 citations to the word site in that book. And it seems to me, because Ron also wrote a book called The Sacred Site, the West Arnhem Land Example, 1970. It was an institute monograph. In that sense, the notion of site was becoming firmly entrenched, incorporated into the established anthropological literature. And it was increasingly also being used outside of the academy in the site-based legislation. The latter part of the 1960s and 70s saw an increase in attempts to protect and preserve Indigenous places and objects through state legislation. Now, the legislation had a number of things in common. So we're talking, just focus, if you like, on the 60s and 70s. We're talking about Aboriginal Heritage Act, Western Australia, was 1972. There was an earlier one in South Australia, which wasn't quite along the lines of sites, but it did involve similar ideas. And it was all designed to protect sites or places. The legislation enacted was often in response to mining and other development, where it was seen to be important. The legislation did not recognise Indigenous rights to country in any way, and the concept of Aboriginal sites was a disconnect from the complexities of religious belief and the relationships first Australians had with their country. The use of the word site, so okay, setting that aside now and going to the Oxford English Dictionary, there's the definition of site. I'm not asking you to read that, but I'll say this about it, all right? A word, first of all, the word site is taken from the built environment, the human-built environment, and it delineates a human activity, either intended or actual. Secondly, it can be used for more nebulous ideas, like in common English we can speak of a holy site, but basically it applies to an idea which involves curtailment or boundedness. The second notion which comes out of it is this, that it is a way of monumentalising place. By monumentalising, I mean that the term site applied to a location of cultural or spiritual significance gives it status and reification. Thus, the terminology of place in Australia has rendered some places as culturally important, either by fact or assertion, such that they have become, as it were, things in themselves. Thus, a sacred site, a secret site, an Aboriginal site. My analysis of these two implicit meanings, bound up with the word site, have consequences for the manner whereby it is employed in both discourse and debate. When writing or speaking of a site, we evoke both circumscription and monumentalisation. An unfortunate, and it is unfortunate indeed, result is that the contingent and essential aspects of the significance of place are lost. Such significance that is attributable is deemed limited to a bounded space or area. The larger picture of the pervasiveness and multilateral and multidimensional meanings of the word are lost. Now, this is not how the ethnography instructs us to represent place within Indigenous belief in practice. In short, land is not merely a series of sites occurring in isolation from the bedrock and ground upon which they are situated. I see this, and this is now my final point, which I'll try and get over in 5 minutes, is to do with how to do things with words. Because I think this is an example of how words have been recruited, I've called it conscripted in the title, to do things that they were never designed to do, and representing things which are in a false and inadequate way. The delimitation and demarcation and restriction of place was very attractive to some people who wanted to develop Australian lands, or the Australian landscape, by radically changing its original form. The idea then, by harnessing the word site, was that these defined little boxes could be managed, and some of them at least could be protected. Development, so-called development, think of that word too, development, i.e. mining, digging up the ground, could navigate a ready path through site avoidance. These are still terms which are very common in practice post-native title, site avoidance. Although some would and did and do fall by the wayside, Juukan Gorge being a recent example. The term site was, as it were, conscripted to a purpose for which it was never intended, because it accommodated mainstream aspirations that accepted a degree of colonial benevolence but could not concede dominion over land. The vocabulary of Indigenous relationships to land saw a significant shift with the introduction of land rights. First in the Northern Territory, 1976, and the others that followed, Pitjantjatjara Land Rights Act and the passage of the Native Title Act, 1993. The recognition of Aboriginal rights to land did not require the piecemeal deconstruction of spiritual relationships to land. Site protection was not the critical legal reference point when Indigenous groups held some form of dominion over their country. So in this, I see that there's a clear divide in the vocabulary of pre- and post-land rights eras, reflecting also local circumstances through time. The predilection to see land as sites in dealing with development in this way were the way things were before land rights. Nukunbar is a prime example. Post-land rights, what can be examined is the rights of those who hold the land under traditional law and custom, or whatever the legislation would have it, and those who wish to enter, use it and exploit it. Sites might be in the equation, but the reckoning is through negotiation and agreement, not bargaining over the future of small fragments of land effectively dissociated from the spiritual whole, or the ngora, as it's called in many, many of the dialects of Aboriginal Australia and languages. It has been my contention in this paper, I'm finishing now, that the use of the term site or sites has many attendant dangers. Be clear, I'm not arguing that the concept of the site, in inverted commas if you like, is incorrect, or that there is not within the Indigenous landscapes places or stations of importance and in a spiritual and religious sense. The protection of such places is important reasons that are existential to those Indigenous Australians who own the country. But what I do argue is that the word site has been conscripted by those who found it convenient to do so. Its continued ill-considered employment truncates Indigenous religious belief to land, sucking out its essential significance, detaching it from the whole, and rendering its meaning partial and incomplete. As anthropologists, and I speak as an anthropologist, we are trained to deconstruct complex social and cultural phenomena and to explain to others how the richness of culture informs and enriches our shared experiences. When we give our expert opinions relating to country, we must do so admitting without ambiguity to its contextured nature. I've worked to show in this paper that there are some words and phrases that must be used with care and qualification, or maybe, and preferably I think in this case, avoided altogether. Thank you. That's a picture from my 78 fieldwork, Sandy Billabong on the Fitzroy River.